Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our speaker series, Reimagining the University, sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. I'm Benjamin Schewel, co-director of the Center on Modernity in Transition.
And I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and together with Ben, I direct COMIT. This series brings together leading thinkers to explore the historical foundations, contemporary patterns, and possible transformations of the modern research university. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Manan Ahmed, Gurminder Bhambra, and Valerie Lambert to discuss post-colonial knowledge.
Manan Ahmed is Associate Professor of History at Columbia University. He is the author of A Book of Conquests, Chachnama and Muslim Origins in South Asia. Gurminder Bhambra is Professor of Post-Colonial and Decolonial Studies in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex. She is the author of Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism, and the Sociological Imagination. Valerie Lambert is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina. She is the author of Native Agency Indians in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and a past president of the Association of Indigenous Anthropologists. Manan, Gurminder, Valerie, a very warm welcome to you all.
Yes, welcome.
So we normally like to begin these conversations on a more personal or biographical note. To start then, I'd like to ask each of you to share with us a little both about the personal and intellectual experiences that led you to decide on a career as a university academic, and about how these personal and intellectual experiences, then and also subsequently while you've been working in the academy, have shaped your thinking about the current state of the modern research university. So Gurminder, perhaps we could begin with you.
Hi. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. In terms of the experiences, I guess one formative one, although I didn't know it at the time, and it was something that I came to understand subsequently, happened at school. So I grew up in Southall, which is a working class, multicultural suburb of London. It actually wasn't part of London when I was growing up, but London sort of expanded to incorporate it over time. And I should say this is in the UK. I went to a regular state school, and one time in our history lesson, we were being taught about the British Empire and colonial histories and so on. And one of the things that my teachers told me was that the British had brought democracy and the railways to India. So I went home, and when my dad asked me, so how was school today? What did you learn? I was like, oh, Dad, did you know the British gave India railways? Isn't that amazing? And he sort of looked at me, sat me down, and decided that maybe my education needed a little broadening, or other perspectives also needed to be brought into it. And I think I found that an incredibly perplexing time in a way, because there was this sense that school was telling me these particular narratives, and it was school. So I assumed that this was the truth that I was being told at school. But I'd go home and tell my dad about stuff, and he'd be like, well, actually, here's another way in which we could think about this. This isn't quite right what's being presented. And so in that sense, I guess there was a sense always for me that is what I'm being told, whether at school or then subsequently at university and so on, is that all that there is to know about the topic? Or perhaps if we took a step back and thought about it from a different sort of perspective, would there be something additional that we could also find out and learn about? So I think that was one key moment.
Thank you so much. Valerie, perhaps you can now share a bit of your own story.
Sure. Thank you, too, for inviting me. I'm really excited about this event and the entire series. So I really appreciate being included and having the opportunity to participate and learn from this. So thank you. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation. I am also a documented descendant of the Chickasaw Nation. These are two American Indian tribal nations in what's now the United States. I was reared in Oklahoma, which is a state that is today about 50% American Indian reservations. And I just want to give sort of three brief snapshots that illuminate my early engagement with academia. They don't really cohere, but I think they do a job of sort of hinting at the complexity, I guess. Now, the first thing is that I decided to enter anthropology for one reason initially, and that is that growing up, a white non-native anthropologist, Morris Opler, attached himself to my family with our permission. This was not at all unusual. Anthropologists often attach themselves to American Indian families and still do, for that matter. But we spent more than a decade with this anthropologist and his wife. And it was during my formative years, my teenage years. Maury and his wife, Lucille, were regular guests at our Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners at our home. And what was remarkable to me is that he was the first non-native person that I met who thought it was a good thing to be native. Now, we natives thought it was a good thing to be native, but no one else did. And it really wasn't until I was about 19 that I knew one non-native who felt that way. And since he was an anthropologist, I thought, well, gosh, there might be other anthropologists who feel that way. And so that's what led me into anthropology. My second little snapshot or anecdote is, well, I guess it's just sort of a realization after I entered anthropology, not long after, that if I became an anthropologist, I could write the kind of books about my people that I wish I had had growing up. There were lots and lots of books about my people that had been published, but there were none that I could see myself or my people in, if you know what I mean. Just I didn't see us reflected in those. And just one example, when I was a young adult, the most recently published book about my tribe, which was authored when I was 15 years old, was a book called The Rise and Fall of the Choctaw Republic. And it was about our being crushed. And this was 1975. I was 4 years old. There were signs that this was not the end of us, as the book implied. So by that time, we were emerging, things were looking up. And particularly by the passage in 1970 of a federal law that allowed us for the first time since 1906 to elect our own leaders. So between 1906 and 1970, the US president insisted upon himself selecting our leaders. So my father was 40 years old before he could vote in a tribal election. And so, I wanted to write what I called the fall and rise of the Choctaw Nation. And I wanted to write about our creativity, our resilience, our genius, our vitality, rather than, our being crushed by colonialism, which is indeed, an important part of the story. And then sort of last, and this one is shorter, in grad school, which was at Harvard, I found a terrific advisor, Stanley Tambaya, or Tambi, as we called him. He's passed away, but a giant in the field of anthropology. He was a Tamil from Sri Lanka. And while I was at Harvard, he was writing a book about his own country and the terrible treatment and discrimination that his Tamil people faced at the hands of the majority Sinhalese population, and before that, British colonists. And this really alerted me to the possibilities that anthropology offered for a liberation of sorts of colonized peoples, and for focusing attention on larger social justice issues. He was just very inspiring. Tambi was incredibly well respected, especially for his intellect, and he made such a big impact on me because he was an Indigenous person.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Manan, you can perhaps share a few thoughts about your own pathway into the academy.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be on this panel. I thank both Shahrzad and you, Ben, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I guess my stories are overlapping with the ones that you already read from my esteemed colleagues. I grew up in a military dictatorship, so skepticism of whatever is being told to you in school or university was a obvious first step. But I did go to universities in very different contexts that I think help shape the type of scholarship I do, but how I might approach today's conversation. So Punjab University in Lahore, which was at that time, the time that I went there, was a government-run institution with a very strict control of what kind of speech is allowed, who can assemble. Student unions were banned. This is in the kind of late 80s. And then I was able to, when I left Pakistan for my higher education, I was kind of lucky enough to be at both UCLA and see kind of that type of public university, but then at a small liberal arts college in Ohio. And then my graduate training was again in a different setting of elite kind of University of Chicago. And what I got from my own personal biography of being at various institutions and experiencing forms of alterity as a young immigrant who is sort of self-sufficient and has to work in order to be at school, is precisely the pressures that Valerie is also talking about, which is who gets to write the histories that you want to read, who gets to speak for you or on your behalf, and what venues are made available for those of us who don't see themselves in the majority that we find ourselves in. And I think part of my own personal way of thinking about the university, which, the kind of story that I encountered when I came to the United States was either quote unquote melting pot or a kind of idealistic venue for dialogue and discourse, was how not so it was. I mean, my graduate school started as 9/11 happened. So all of the kind of ideas of what constitutes availability of discourse kind of shut down. And as a Muslim man studying Islamic history, there wasn't a whole lot of kind of availability of, let's say free and, kind of generous run of ideas. So I think the universities have been historically places where certain types of expertise is allowed to flourish, but more often than not, it's the type of stories that Valerie has just hinted at, and that these are others telling the stories on behalf of, let's say, structural hegemonic powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for so openly sharing some of that personal background with us. Gurminder, in the introduction to an edited volume on Decolonizing the University, you and your co-authors write, taking colonialism as a global project as the starting point, it becomes difficult to turn away from the Western University as a key site through which colonialism, and colonial knowledge in particular, is produced, consecrated, institutionalized, and naturalized. That chapter then concludes that, and I'm quoting again, the foundations of universities remain unshakably colonial. Now, that is, of course, true metaphorically, but it can also be true in a more literal sense. In North America, for example, many universities were built both on the unceded land of indigenous nations and through the exploitation of enslaved African-American labor. So I want to start by asking each of you to tell us about how you would characterize this relationship between coloniality and the modern university. Valerie, perhaps we can begin with you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I want to, continue with the personal and, in that way, sort of ground my remarks. I want to talk about the colonial foundation of the university where I am a professor, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This university was chartered in 1789 as an institution designed to educate and further the careers of white men. It was founded with the intent of promoting the expansion of white supremacy and settler colonialism in North Carolina and in the rest of the then very newly created United States of America. It was founded on the unceded lands of one or more of the native nations, the original sovereign nations of what is now the United States, and the names of those particular sovereign nations who inhabited the land where the university was built has not been affirmed. There is no accepted historical or archaeological evidence that any indigenous peoples lived on that land during the 3 decades preceding the establishment of North Carolina as a crown colony in 1729. And this raises really important questions about colonization, violence, and disease, all of which likely work together to reduce or even eliminate the original inhabitants of those parcels of land during this period. It is not likely, as the university has maintained, that the land was simply uninhabited. Rather, settlers rendered it relatively or perhaps even wholly uninhabited by indigenous nations. The land was not ownerless, and we have no evidence that the owners received any compensation for their land. And then sort of moving on to another layer of this, UNC substantially funded its operations through wealth derived from land documented as stolen from the Chickasaw Nation, and I'm a documented descendant of the Chickasaw Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and my husband, who's also a UNC professor, is a citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, so his tribe, and several other sovereign nations in California and other Western states. I mean, we're the classic land grab university. UNC reaped significant profits that are worth, with interest, an estimated $7 billion from stolen Chickasaw and Cherokee lands alone. And those together total more than 200,000 acres. And then sort of another layer of this is that UNC relied upon enslaved and otherwise unfree African-American labor to construct its buildings and facilities. And it also used profits from the sale of enslaved human beings to fund university operations. Without this labor and the wealth derived from this stolen land, UNC just would not exist as we know it today. There are 2 historians, white historians, Lucas Kelly and Garrett Wright, who have concluded that without the profits that UNC reaped from more than 200,000 acres of stolen Chickasaw and Cherokee lands alone, more than 100 years ago, UNC would surely have closed its doors due to insolvency. So it's just incredibly painful to live and work at a university who profited so handsomely from the stolen land of my people and my husband's people, and to just walk through the campus, knowing of that history that is still being suppressed and not acknowledged by most of the vast majority of those who work at the university or who attend the university.
Thank you. Manan, how would you respond to the question?
Thank you, Valerie. That's such a powerful and clear articulation of how the university as a system has benefited from the exploitation and wealth stealing of the land and property of Native communities. I teach at Columbia. This particular space is the place where the Lenape and the Wappinger peoples were in existence and continue to be in existence. And here the myth of kind of the sale of Manhattan is taught to students, and they are taken to this fake plaque where Manhattan was supposedly sold, and that is a part of the school textbooks. The university itself, the physical infrastructure of the university, comes from the wealth generated by the Astor family in the opium and the quote unquote fur trade industries. Both of them were exploitated both on the national and an international scale. The Dodge families, which a number of buildings on our campus are named after, and have folks in the Dodge family, are known for founding what we now call the American university system. So AUB, American University of Beirut, American University of Cairo. So the infrastructure within which I exist as a paid employee of Columbia University is very much as deeply a part of the history of colonization and settler colonialism The Columbia Slavery Project, which began after Brown and other universities had begun such investigations, continues to create and mark new ways in which the university has benefited from the histories of enslavement on this continent. But I think one of the important ways in which Gurminder or Professor Bhambra's point is so poignant is also in the intellectual work that I do. One of the ways in which the field in which I am, the history of medieval or early modern history of South Asia, is formed by the university that we don't call it a university, but it was meant in its inception as the quote unquote Oxford of the East, which is Fort William College in Calcutta, and a university founded in order to train East India Company employees to govern the colony in the mid 18th century. In 1800, it was formed in 1800. So you have entire fields of study in which I have spent my adult life kind of engaging in the histories of philology, the histories of kind of Oriental studies, histories of early Islam, that are shaped by the both structural domination on the American peninsula, but also in the colony itself, on how these disciplines come into being and what shape they take and who gets to kind of study, as we were discussing earlier. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gurminder, I introduced this question by sharing some of your observations on the colonial foundations of universities. But you've also been very clear that the university is not intrinsically colonial, that there have been institutions of higher learning across much of the world prior to the advent of European institutions and despite European colonization. Universities, you remind us, can also be vital repositories of the common learning of communities. So I want to ask you, as we look forward to transforming the university, what might we gain from also looking back?
Yes, no, I mean, one of the things that I've really appreciated in the responses from both Manan and Valerie has been the sort of location of this question, or the thinking through of this question in the materiality of things, as well as thinking about the way in which the actual historical processes of colonization have shaped universities in very particular sorts of ways. I mean, particularly in terms of the knowledge they produce. I think just to step back to your earlier question first, one of the things that I did want to mention in relation to that, in terms of how we think about the university in relation to colonization, is yes, absolutely, universities were part of the colonial processes by way of which European states trained personnel, administrators, and others to go out and do stuff, and the ways in which those people extracted knowledge from local interlocutors and brought it back and, in a sense, consolidated it in particular sorts of ways to establish it as knowledge. And so there's certainly that aspect of things. And there was the setting up of institutions, particularly in the settler colonies and dominions of the British Empire, but also these training colleges within India and in other of the colonies. And at the same time, one of the things that the British certainly did, and would be interested to know more about the ways in which other empires were also implicated in this, was the disestablishment of existing educational institutions in India. So there was the blanket sort of, as the British extended their rule across the subcontinent, one of the first things that they did in incorporating new territories was actually to disestablish existing institutions of education. Why? Because there's something then about the university that is also powerful in its ability to produce and reproduce a response to colonization. And so I guess there I would be a little bit, or this is one of the reasons why I'm quite skeptical about the call to abolish the university, because the abolition of the university was something done by colonizers themselves, at the same time as the university has also been a site for how one might train colonial administrators. And so in that sense, I think one of the things that we need to think about is the fact that universities have performed different functions at different times and in different places. And so we need to think about what is the function of the institution at any particular time before thinking about whether is it good or is it bad. So I don't think universities are intrinsically problematic or intrinsically colonial. I think they've been part of the colonial project in very particular sorts of ways, and we need to examine that, investigate that, and think about how universities need to be transformed. And so in that sense, I guess I would take quite a pragmatic approach to the question. And indeed, that the quote that you use, that universities are a vital repository of the common learning of communities, that comes from John Dewey, the classic sort of pragmatist philosopher. And so I think there's something very positive there about how the university as an institution can be understood. And one of the things that we need to understand is that that community is never a singular community. It's often a common repository for the common learning of communities. And the plurality there points to what for me would be a fundamental function of universities, which is this aspect of learning. So universities aren't simply about the reproduction of knowledge. They're also sites of learning. And one of the ways in which we learn is by listening to others. And if universities can be those sorts of places, then I think that's something that it's very powerful to keep a hold of.
Valerie and Manan, I want to give you a chance to respond to Gurminder if you'd like. Valerie?
I just found those comments that Gurminder made very interesting and thought-provoking, and particularly this, the project of breaking down, crushing our indigenous institutions of higher learning, and just what kind of lessons we can learn from sort of a longer perspective that understands that form of violence, and in the context of what we're trying to do today. I also like Gurminder's attention to practical things that we can do. When I was reflecting upon my thoughts before I arrived here, then I was thinking, these are big questions that demand, dreaming big. But I found myself, I'm in a space right now where I'm trying to think very practically about, how to move forward. And so I really appreciate, the attention to that. And so, I guess I'm going to turn it back to Professor Ahmed to hear his thoughts while sort of just sharing those initial impressions of Gurminder's really important remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I fully agree with my colleagues. I think one of the things that we, when we say that university existed elsewhere and prior to the idea of the modern university or the idea of the modern colonial university, I think we're absolutely right in calling attention to the types of practices, whether of dialogue, of training, of pedagogy, of research that predate, let's just say, the 19th century. And I think we would be correct in that. I think I guess the position I take on that question is that the destruction and annihilation of classes of individuals that we would call teachers and professors in modes other than the university setting, libraries, archives, common language for how, common classificatory language, I apologize for the noise, the destruction and annihilation of that vocabulary and those epistemic structures means that the university in its modern form dominates our kind of intellectual or imaginative horizons. And this was done very practically, as in one of the things I researched for my last book was actually lists of libraries, household libraries, and collective libraries that British colonial officers passed around in order to get them accumulated and transferred out to Berlin, to London, to Paris, to Yale, to Harvard. Obviously, these types of acquisitions are done in the name of the university, in order to found university libraries, in order to found research institutions in Europe or in North America. We've just recently heard about Harvard's kind of report on both indigenous remains and indigenous artifacts that are in their museums and in their libraries. So this project of amassment has deep roots, and it is tied to the destruction of, let's just say, a kind of knowledge economy that we want to call university before the colonial ideas of university, or university as a modern institution, comes into being. I guess pragmatically, that's the kind of issue that I keep kind of hitting my head at. Like, how do we kind of how do we now create any kind of system where those resources are when those resources are still held in the North or in the global North writ large? Those archives, those manuscripts, those artifacts are buried in libraries such as Columbia's or Bodleian or Cambridge, etc. And so the destruction of the university isn't something simply that happened in the past. It's an ongoing and a process that's happening into our future. I cannot imagine a future in Pakistan, in Lahore, where a modern university can actually act as a modern research space, precisely because the artifacts and material required for that research, speaking very, very specifically about history and other social scientific knowledge, simply does not exist in that country.
So our next question continues on the theme that you've been starting to explore in your responses. And what we'd like to do now is to draw your attention to one possible complexity involved in thinking about what it would practically mean to decolonize the university. So in the 20th century, the efforts of people to depart from colonial empires have often taken shape as nation-building projects. And many of these nation-building projects, as we're all aware, have been influenced by impulses towards some kind of imagined cultural or ethnic or religious purity. This is something that's been destructive for many people. And so what we begin to see in recent years is a number of historians and social scientists, including Manan and others, who begin to stress and explore how identities and ideals that flourish in pre and early modern imperial configurations might have actually encouraged the kinds of ethnic, cultural, and religious intermingling that modern nation states have struggled to achieve. So insofar as the establishment of modern research universities has played a role in the 20th century post-colonial nation-building project, this raises two important interrelated questions. First, are there any real risks that current efforts to decolonize university curricula might, whether implicitly or explicitly, end up repeating or reinforcing the impulses toward national purity and homogeneity that have caused and continue to cause so much suffering for diverse peoples throughout the world? And second, and relatedly, how might we think about or practically go about decolonizing the modern research university and its curricula in ways that don't repeat these homogeneity mistakes from the past? So Manan, perhaps we can start with you, and we'd invite you to speak both from your specialist research activities, but as well from your personal experience in the modern research university.
Thank you. I mean, it's a kind of hard question, but that's what makes this conversation valuable to have. I think partly we have to understand that the university during the formal period of decolonization becomes kind of totemically linked to a nationalist project, or the project of making the peoples of the newly independent nation. So it takes on a very specific function, which the university in the West, while doing it, obviously also making their elite, their governing elite, was able to, I don't want to say market away, but was able to at least diffuse that very explicitness. So one could have the idea of the liberal arts education, or the Common Core, as the Columbia University did at the aftermath of the First World War, which was a civilizational training. And of course, we are going to go ahead and become, masters of the universe. But before we get there, we're going to all read Plato together, which is, I teach that every year. the national university, the post-colonial national university, or university in the decolonial sense, decolonial period, had to kind of become a space in which a type of very explicit production of the kind of new citizen of the new nation had to take place. So in that context, and with that being said, I think the claims of decoloniality or indigeneity that I am most familiar with, that are happening in universities in India, and in fact in some places in Pakistan, are precisely what is troubling. As in, these are majoritarian claims for homo-nationalism, or a type of majoritarian idea of a particular sectarian understanding of Islam, or Hinduness, etc. And precisely the unbroken line between colonial ideas of the self and identity that are taken up by the nation state and valorized, and those ideas are now being championed as indigenous. The Prime Minister Modi is a very kind of explicit, uses this quite explicitly. And I think the spirit of decolonization, which is the spirit of anti-colonial struggle and the freedom of all peoples, that's what I find is the most productive for us to hold on to as we reimagine or think about what it means to be in a university setting, or what it is that a university ought to be or can become. And I think simply a claim that a curriculum should be decolonized, or a decolonial type of formal identity-based kind of structure be put in place is not enough. That's not the point. Is not that we need sort of kind of surface representation. We need representation of ideas and histories and modes of living that were effaced and destroyed by colonialism. That's the actual struggle. The struggle isn't simply that we have a person of color in a leading position, or that a certain author that was never taught in a curriculum be put into the curriculum in order to give that curriculum a decolonial kind of overall vibe. And so I think I find that conversation to be difficult, precisely because the spirit and the letter of that resistance and that call are, I find them to be at some distance from each other. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very, very stimulating. Gurminder, how might you respond to the question?
I mean, I think I would want to respond to it in part by saying that many of the things just identified by Manan are also central to the ways in which colleagues and people here in Britain think about these issues. So whilst, I mean, one of the things that I've been centrally committed to is to try and persuade Europeans in particular that colonialism wasn't something that simply happened over there, and that it has nothing to do with what happens in Europe. So when we talk about the post-colonial, we're often referring to the places that had been colonized, and yet nowhere can be colonized without somebody having colonized them. And so the post-colonial ought also to refer to those countries that were involved in the process of colonizing. And so what does it mean for Britain to decolonize itself? How could Britain be decolonized when it doesn't even acknowledge that it had been a colonizer, and therefore anything needs to shift? And so in this sense of having the luxury of not having to take into account that colonial past, there's this assumption that Britain is a nation, that it's always been a nation, and that the questions that both confront it as a nation and confront us as scholars within the university institutions within the nation are simply those questions of the nation. What does that do? That makes those people who can demonstrate a history of belonging to the nation be seen as citizens. And it makes those of us who have a history of belonging to the empire are regarded as immigrants. And the division then between citizens and immigrants is, used politically in the present to argue for rights and entitlements for some and not for others. Why this then matters and what a decolonized approach would do would be to think about the colonial frame more specifically in terms of thinking about the history of Britain. So one of the arguments that's happening at the moment politically has always been, every election this comes up, that those people, and at the moment it's framed in terms of refugees and asylum seekers, but it's also been leveled at immigrants more broadly, is that your families haven't ever paid in to the welfare state. Why should you have access to the benefits of the welfare state when there's nothing, historically you haven't contributed? And yet from research that I've done recently, one of the things that I discovered is that actually colonial subjects in India, and this is the Indian subcontinent under empire, paid taxes which went to the government in Westminster to do with what it wished. So welfare for national citizens was paid for by the taxes of colonial subjects. And this is at a time when the working class and middle class in Britain were exempt from having to pay income tax. And so if we're talking about what it would mean to have a cosmopolitan, plural understanding of Britain, that would be something whereby the multiculturalism of Britain doesn't start in the post-war period when ostensible migrants come to Britain. The multiculturalism of Britain is established in the construction of an empire that incorporates other cultures and peoples within it. And so if we recognize Britain as having been multicultural over the centuries, then we would perhaps have less angst about its multiculturalism in the present when that multiculturalism is confined to a smaller sort of space. So I think the work of decolonization is needed much more in the metropole than it is elsewhere. Nobody who has been colonized forgets the fact that they had been colonized. But the colonizers very rarely remember that the benefits, that every single thing that they have achieved and have comes through the labor, resources, and effort of others. And for me, that's what decolonization would actually be about.
Thank you so much, Gurminder. It's extremely interesting insights. So Valerie, we'd invite you to respond to this question, but also perhaps in light of your earlier invocation of your desire to think practically about these questions, we'd like to ask you to think about the following hypothetical situation. So let's suppose that an American university, could be University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, could be another, but one that's sitting on indigenous land that was built by enslaved labor, had formulated the sincere intention of redressing the harms inflicted through processes of land disposition and exploitation. So practically, what would that actually entail? Or what are some elements of a response that they might pursue? And what might a university operating in a more repaired state of relationships to its history, to indigenous populations, to formerly enslaved populations, to the land, what might the relationships that underpin such a university look like?
Wow, big question. Well, I've been working together with others in a group called the Abya Yala Sovereign Nation Citizens Collective. We're a group of indigenous faculty at UNC-Chapel Hill. And again, I'll just, ground my my comments and descriptions in what's going on here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And we've been sort of working on two fronts. One is to work very concertedly to make demands of the university with respect to the indigenous land dispossession, the profits from stolen land, the wealth that was generated from that, the use of and sale of enslaved Black labor to build the university, et cetera. So together with, we indigenous faculty, together with Black faculty and some white allied faculty, have called for 3 initiatives with that respect. We have a bigger curricular project that I might discuss later, but I'll just focus on this immediate thing here. We've called for the 3 initiatives are: first, UNC needs to fully fund, without monetary restraint, independent research into the history of illegitimately acquired land and labor, so that we have a more comprehensive knowledge of what happened. And we need, and as part of that, we need to have answers to the question of which nations and individuals have legitimate claims based on these illegitimate and unethical actions. Second, UNC needs to consult with these indigenous nations and individuals, identifying specific ways to redress fully and without monetary restraint these illegitimate and unethical actions. And then finally, and this is a bit vague, but when I pivot to the curricular work we're doing, it gets a little bit more specific. We have been calling on UNC to undertake substantial actions to reconfigure itself as an anti-racist and anti-colonial institution, especially in light of its historical origins as an institution of white supremacy and settler colonialism designed to educate white men.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to see these precise steps that are being taken at your institution right now. So Manan and Gurminder, we'd like you pretend you could respond to Valerie, you could respond to each other's comments, but we'd like to make space for each of you to offer a few additional thoughts. Manan, we can start with you.
Sure, thank you. I really appreciate learning about what Ms. Lambert has been talking about, steps that they're doing at UNC. I think one of the things that those comments highlighted for me is that the university's role both in kind of driving and presenting research so that we kind of have an understanding of the world in which we live in, and of course the university's own past. That is to study thyself in a very critical way, but to fund people, students, faculty from marginalized, minoritized backgrounds. And I think the third part, the curricular part, which I'm eager to learn more about, perhaps is one of the most important, because universities do shape the citizenry, the world that our graduate and undergraduate students are going to shape. So that role, the pedagogical role of the university, the role where we get to actually create a classroom that is explicitly kind of performing the anti-colonial, anti-racist ways in perceiving the world and our histories, the classroom that is equitable and inclusive, the classroom that creates spaces for perspectives other than Goldman Sachs, etc. I think that part of the university's kind of role, to me, is incredibly important. And at Columbia, there is no such effort, but one can dream. Columbia is the undergraduate experience at Columbia College revolves around a 2-year-long sequence that we call the core, in which we kind of study, as I mentioned earlier, everything from Aristotle all the way to contemporary political theory and literature. And those 2 years, which is a lot of pedagogical hours. So the classes that the students take, they're mandatory. They're 4 hours a week, seminars. Right. So think about it. You're 18, 19 years old, and you're like actually in a classroom for an entire year, 4 hours a week with a particular text. I mean, how formative an experience can that be? And when that experience is not resting on a particular, again, to borrow Professor Lambert's phrases, anti-racist, anti-colonial kind of analytical lens, then it's going to enable a very different type of worldview possible. So I'm really taken by the efforts described, and I think for the university to kind of take seriously that part of pedagogy and what does pedagogy look like outside of these frameworks would be incredibly important in my perspective. Thank you.
Gurminder, would you have any other thoughts to add to the conversation?
Yes, and it's sort of picking up on one of the questions in the Q&A put in by Mary Louise Pratt around the sort of blindness of the domestic subject of colonialism and to what extent were universities complicit in this. And I think it's very, I mean, so one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is to think through the ways in which the very conceptual architecture of the social sciences is organized around the idea of the nation as the methodological unit of analysis. And because we start with the nation and we think both backwards and forwards in relation to the nation, then what we miss are the broader connections that that nation has been embedded in. So to talk about Britain as a nation is never or it makes no sense. So if we think about the history of Britain, Britain itself only comes into being in 1707 when you have the Act of Union between the kingdoms of England and Scotland. Both England and Scotland separately had colonies, and when they unite together as Britain, they go on to effectively rule over about a quarter of the world's land territory. And so in that sense, Britain itself as an entity has never been a nation. It's only been an empire. And yet you will very rarely have any course of learning in a British institution that starts from the idea of Britain being an imperial state, as opposed to Britain being a nation state. And so it's the very common sense, if you like, understandings that continue to permeate across universities, society, etc., which sets the parameters through which all subsequent work goes on. So this is not to say that there aren't courses in history departments looking at aspects of the British Empire, but it's always this thing that you have Britain and it has an empire, and that empire is separate to thinking about what Britain itself is. Whereas the argument I would want to make is that there is no way that we can understand Britain without understanding it always as imperial. And how would that then change the ways in which we think about these issues? And so this sort of domestic blindness is produced, I would say that it's part of the conceptual architecture of the concepts, the categories, all of that stuff that we use within the social sciences. It's just there. And unless we can unpack it and rethink this from the perspective of histories that are more adequate to the task, then we're going to continue to doing that. So I think it's important that we do the sorts of things that were mentioned earlier in terms of the ways in which we think about issues of pedagogy within the classroom, we think about who gets taught, how it's taught, and so on. But I think there's further epistemological work that's also needed to be done to actually engage with the disciplines themselves and what it is that they facilitate us to assume as opposed to interrogate. And then what might emerge as different if we were to do that.
Valerie, I see you nodding vigorously. I was wondering if you'd like to add or respond to that.
Wow. Well, that gives me a lot to think about. I am sort of interested in pivoting over to the curricular part of that. Is this, is this a good time to do that, or should I?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. And, this actually comes out of conversations that I've had with Professor Pratt, who asked the question, many years ago, a global indigeneity conference in Venice that, helped give rise to this, this effort to decolonize the university at a curricular level. We've been establishing a global indigeneity curriculum. It's in process with aspirations for department status, although that's problematic because a lot of this project is about breaking down these disciplinary silos, which are part of the problem, in my opinion. But it's a curriculum that recognizes that colonization, indigenous land dispossession, imperialism, et cetera, are pernicious forces that have produced the world we live in today. And indigeneity has grown out of colonialism. And trying to illuminate and study this is the backbone of this global indigeneity curriculum, looking at conditions created by colonialism and imperialism and indigenous resistance as well. We want and need that department to be led by indigenous faculty and to decenter the United States. So this academic year, we have doubled the number of indigenous tenured and tenure-track faculty in the college. Sadly, that means, we've gone from 4 indigenous faculty to 8. We hired as a distinguished named chair, a Chickasaw Nation citizen, Amanda Cobb, as part of that effort to redress the harms and to build upon that stolen in Chickasaw Nation land and provide a pipeline for Chickasaw Nation students to attend free of charge and with research funds the university. Then, we've hired 3 more indigenous faculty, all of those 3 were born and reared outside the United States. So again, trying to decenter the United States. So we have a citizen of the Mosquito Nation reared in Nicaragua, a citizen of the Nahua Nation of Mexico, a citizen of the Ainu population of Japan, who is part of a doubly colonized because she is also of Korean descent, so affiliated with 2 colonized people. And, and we want to hire indigenous faculty members from throughout the world, Africa, the Middle East, India, elsewhere. And, we want a canon that we teach from that centers marginalized scholars. We want our criteria for tenure and promotion to be based not solely on publications, as it is currently at UNC, but it substantially involves service to and work for Indigenous peoples. And, most of us Indigenous scholars have taken lots and lots of time away from our professional careers to engage in this kind of work. When our tribe steps up and asks us to do something, in 2013 is a good example. For 2 years, I worked on a land claims case for the Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaw Nation against the United States. And we got none of the land back from that claim. We did get $186 million from the U.S. government as, just pay and get rid of us. But we do a lot of this kind of work that is completely, uncompensated and unrecognized, and undervalued, completely not valued by the university. So we want to change that. And then, there are other features of this, one of which is that suppressed and colonized languages and the revitalization of those languages are at the heart of our curriculum. So we're talking about Cherokee, Choctaw, Korean, Wolof, even Frisian, and really push back against the dominance, which is growing, unfortunately, of English and other European languages, of Japanese, of Chinese. And I guess I'll stop there, but these are some of the ideas and some of the initiatives that we're moving forward with.
Picking up exactly where Valerie left off, this series, as you know, is called Reimagining the University. And in that spirit of reimagination, we want to invite you to consider what the university could be. So as vital as it is to critique various aspects of Western modernity, whether that be colonialism, racism, capitalism, or nationalism, critique doesn't, of course, necessarily offer a positive goal for how we understand knowledge or how we render ourselves. In that light, we'd like to ask you more explicitly to articulate or go further in articulating a positive vision of the university that moves beyond coloniality and Western-centric modernity. So, for example, what kinds of knowledge might this imagined university produce? What kinds of methodologies would it employ? What kind of person or self would its educational processes give rise to? What would be its relationships to the immediate community in which it is embedded and to the land on which it stands? And more broadly, what would be its relationship to humanity as a whole? So paint us a picture, if you would, of that reimagined university. Gurminder, we'll go to you first.
Okay, so big question. I mean, from the work that I've done, one of the things that I'm clear about is that there is a paradox to the calling for the decolonizing of the university, because decolonization is a political process. It's not something that can be disembedded from those broader political purposes. And if we were to think about what does decolonizing mean within a university context, for me, it would be about putting colonization in, i.e., an understanding of colonialism in. Because one of the things that I find marks universities, particularly within Europe and North America, is their refusal to engage with the extent to which they materially, but also intellectually, have been shaped and formed by colonial practices and by colonialism more broadly. And so until we explicitly acknowledge colonialism, then we're not really going to be able to move beyond colonialism. And so in that sense, I'm less interested in reimagining the university as an ideal space. I'm more interested in thinking about what work would need to be done to recreate the university from where we are. And that work, I've argued, is located in an understanding of reparations that are both material, in the sense that, as I was saying earlier, there is no institution of higher learning or private schools as they are in the UK and so on, that hasn't benefited materially from colonial proceeds. So in the same way that you talk about universities in the US being established on unceded land through the use of coerced labor and so on, in the very same way, in the UK context, every institution will have been funded through colonial proceeds. This is what Dadabhai Naoroji and others have called colonial drain. The extent of money that was taken from the colonies was used to establish every institution that there is within the colonizing states. And so one needs to both account for the investment in institutional organizations within the metropole and the disinvestment that occurred, both the explicit disestablishment, as I was talking earlier, of educational institutions, but then also the lack of funds that were then available for those institutions, because all of them had been extracted and taken elsewhere. So there's a material reparation that's needed, which has to also then be grounded in an epistemological reparation. And that would be an undoing of the knowledge claims that have been established on the basis of colonialism, especially where they refuse to explicitly acknowledge the colonialism that is at their heart. And how would we rethink those practices or those understandings in order to shape our practices differently? So I think for me, the ideal university from this particular moment would be the reparative university. It would be a university that was committed to understanding itself, broader society, as a consequence of these colonial processes and working to transform them. And what that would look like, it would require us to work together in the ways that Valerie has highlighted earlier. You know, this is not something that can be done by an individual or an individual community. It requires us all to work together towards a world that's different from the world that we currently inhabit.
Manan?
Thank you again for such generative responses. It makes me think. I guess I'll start here. Before that, I can imagine a more perfect university. I want to recognize that the context that I know of, which would be, broadly speaking, the South Asia context and United States, the university is under direct assault, under direct threats from legislatures, from industry of various sorts, and even, I want to say, from social and civic society. In India and Pakistan, the question of defunding, the question of appointments, and the question of what kind of can you study, what kind of events you can have on campus, the security of life and limb for faculty member and for students. Those are kind of active things that are happening at the moment in which we speak, and have been happening for the last few years, if not longer. In the United States, we have obviously legislatures going towards trying to end tenure. They have almost succeeded already in Florida, and other places are coming next. The attacks on so-called CRT, critical race theory, all of those are directly shaping what is allowed or possible in the kind of space that we call the university, which is not to even invoke the type of extreme economic restrictions placed on the study of humanities and social sciences. So that's, I think for all of it, before I try to imagine a more better university, I just wanted us to recognize that university as it exists is a threatened institution. And the masters of our current universe, the software bros, etc., are incredibly open and forthright about what they perceive to be is an archaic system that should be thrown away. So that's just to say before I say anything. I think in a more positive way, the universities where I have had my education have been segregated institutions. They've been segregated in space. They've been segregated in intellectual histories and thoughts. They've been segregated in the classroom. The segregation has been racial. The segregation has been driven by ideological and intellectual concerns. I have, on a very personal note, been trying to work outside the formal university where I teach. I've tried to take the history of the resistance to the curtailing of civil rights by African-American intellectuals. Malcolm X had started in Harlem a freedom school. Freedom schools were key institutions developed in order to be pedagogical enterprises in the community outside of formal university systems. They operated as an open model, open to people who had the time and capacity to join conversations and how to sustain them. I've been working on projects on my own for the last couple of years with some colleagues on kind of rethinking what that freedom school model can do for us, and how can we reinvigorate that history, that is history in this country specifically. There are kind of models of this in South Asia, especially when it comes to kind of Dalit education, where Gita V and others have done it for 30, 40 years under the very specific model of kind of freedom school, although it's not called freedom school in that system. So I think that with that model, which is a model that's community-based, that privileges a dialogue rather than a professorial student relationship, that creates a relationship which can enrich both the kind of knowledge that is being generated, but the knowledge which is being drawn upon. So it creates a reservoir of archive that can be utilized for direct political action. Those are the types of capacities that, if I was asked to create a positive version of a university, that I would love to incorporate in the institutions that I am a part of and I draw my salary from. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie.
Yeah, I just have learned so much. I really appreciate, hearing from all of you. One thing I want to draw attention to, as we think, in big ways about decolonizing the university, is this unbroken history of violence that just, it has unbroken history from the beginnings of colonization. So it, was very prominent with indigenous land dispossession. Colonization was thoroughly violent, and that's not acknowledged. We have gun violence in our schools and universities today. There's violence anti-Black racism that erupts in violence, violence against those based on sexual orientation, gender identity. We have at the university, on our campuses, we have incredibly high rates that are unreported and, largely unreported and squashed by the university, high rates of rape and sexual violence. So when we talk about remaking the university, we need to look really squarely at violence and try to figure out how are we going to move to a space that is literally safe, and then that is not based upon these layers and layers of violence and that perpetuates violence.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I want to give you each maybe a chance to share some closing words or thoughts reflecting on the entire conversation and on the theme of the series as a whole. Gurminder, perhaps we'll start with you and then each have a few minutes to offer some closing remarks.
I mean, it's sort of a little bit difficult to think about what to say. The conversation has been so incredibly wide-ranging. I think perhaps one common theme that's come out is the need for us really to reckon with the histories that have produced us and the ways in which academic knowledge sometimes obscures our ability to recognize those histories within what it is that we go on to do. So what does it mean to have a course in Western civilization that doesn't account for the violence, as Valerie so strongly put it, that's at the heart of Western civilization? We talk instead about sort of ideals and beauty and philosophy and things of the mind, but what about the actual things that were done in the context of these sorts of arguments that are being put forward? And so a proper reckoning is really very long overdue. And it's not as if others in other places aren't aware of these histories and haven't been doing that work. One of the things that I'm always reminded of is the work that Dadabhai Naoroji did. And there were others who did work before him. He was he was a key figure within the Indian independence movement. He established, or was certainly part of the founding of the Indian National Congress in the late 19th, early 20th century. He wrote a book called How the British Empire Creates Poverty in India, explicitly making the link between the way in which the British were operating in India and then the drain and so on. And he's written a whole book on it in English that's published in London. And yet very few British academics would ever know of him. What makes that even more extraordinary is that he's one of the first people who's not white to be elected to the British Parliament. He's elected as an MP for a London constituency and represents that constituency in Parliament and is making these arguments. And so there's this sense in which it's not that these are marginal figures, but they certainly have been marginalized in the process. But it's not as if they were sitting in a room hidden at the back of Beyond and nobody knew what they were saying. He was standing in Parliament making these speeches at the heart of the British state. So for him to be completely disappeared from any history of what it is to be British or what it is for the British state to be shaped in particular ways is quite an extraordinary act of disavowal. So in that sense, so I think that one point perhaps we should remember is that there are very rarely marginal figures. They are marginalized. And that's the process. So what are the processes by way of which people are disappeared, both materially, but also intellectually? And so when we bring them back in, we need to also recover or think through the histories that had excluded them in the first place. So it's never enough as to have a diverse reading list. We need to think about the ways in which those reading lists and those curricula were constructed in particular ways, and what sort of work is needed to construct them now in different ways. And there is work that's central to that. And I think that's something that we shouldn't shy away from.
Valerie?
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation the importance of capitalism and how, and sort of on the theme of, what are the histories that have created us, and how are we to engage in a kind of reckoning with respect to those. What has capitalism done, and how to what it is so baked into our universities. We talk about, it's just so, what has it done to, interfere and undermine learning? To come back to that concept of, learning, which should be at the heart of the university. I'd also like to sort of foreground individualism. And particularly, I see this, with my Indigenous students, Indigenous faculty members as well, people who hail from colonized peoples. We do not come into the university and shouldn't be viewed as coming into the university as individuals. We are coming as parts of a community, and we bring our communities into the walls of the institution. And for us to consistently be treated as individuals is another form of violence against us. And so I think sort of recognizing some of the ways that the university has been shaped by capitalism, individualism, and more is also part of this massive project of decolonizing the university.
Yeah, such great points. Manan, the last word here goes to you.
Well, in that spirit, then I would just say that I think what Professor Bhambra and Lambert have said needs nothing more than an affirmation from me. I think, just building on their perspective, say that, our imagination of university has to incorporate the vast amount of learning and doing that occurs in fields such as science and business and economics, and where some of the concerns, or all of the concerns that have been articulated here today, seem to those students, because of the disciplinary forms in which those enterprises are constructed, as the concerns themselves are seen as marginal, or not of their kind of, not about them, not about the type of work they want to do or the type of university that they belong to. And I think nothing could be further from the truth, not only because universities are tied to the capitalist and colonial and nationalist enterprises, and so everything a university touches is thus implicated and is open to the type of disciplinary epistemic kind of autopsy that Professor Bhambra was talking about. But I think we need to articulate it as such to our colleagues, to our students, such that the idea of the university, why aren't the questions of the idea of the university not being raised in the engineering schools? Why are they not being raised in the medical schools? Why are they not being raised in the business schools? Much of the university's footprint is actually geared towards those. Again, I speak of my own kind of experience and my limited understanding, is geared on those fields. The social sciences and the humanities occupy a much smaller literal footprint in the architectonics of the university. And I do believe that it is incumbent upon us to, when we have these conversations, such as this very valuable conversation that both of you have organized, is to bring our colleagues from the professional schools, from the and to say, hey, what does it look like to you? Why is the history of colonialism not important to the type of work that you think you're doing? What is it that makes you think that you are not part of a nation state or not part of a heritage? And I think that to me is an important part of how I would want to kind of proceed from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Manan Ahmed, Gurminder, Bhambra, and Valerie Lambert. Such a rich and vitally important conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Many thanks also to our sponsors, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us again next time on Friday, April 28th at 10 a.m. Eastern, that's 7 a.m. Pacific, when Ben and I will welcome Cornel West, Jennifer Frey, and Joseph Chan to discuss Are Universities Too Liberal? See you then.